what we're going to do now, and really for the rest of the semester that we have, the several sessions we have left, is we're now going to switch from talking about the crisis itself with all of its causes and nature and consequences to solutions. In other words, what is to be done about this? What did Mr. Bush and his administration do when he was president? What is the Obama administration doing now? What's the logic? What are the problems? And what alternatives might there be? Either because alternatives in the sense that in other crises in the United States and elsewhere, other measures were taken that are not being taken here. What about those? How do we explain that they're not being taken here this time? And finally, some suggestions of alternatives that you don't hear about, but that ought to be discussed too, because there really are other ways of dealing with this problem. At the very least, they ought to be discussed, and they're not being, and that's a contribution I can make to this. Okay. And these are some of the things we're going to need to talk about. Don't get worried about this. I'll go through that. It's not at all complicated. So the question is, first, what is the strategy, in a sense, that is being used? And I'm focusing on the United States, because that's what I know and that's where we are. I'll make some comments from time to time about how the Japanese or Europeans or others are trying to cope, but it's really about the United States. What is the strategy that is being used? And I put it in the singular, the strategy, because with all due respect to Obama, it isn't all that different what he's doing from what Bush did. And you'll see that as we go along, so I think it's reasonable for me to say to you that there's a strategy here. And this strategy, and this is something that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, this strategy goes by the name of Keynesian economics. That's pretty much what it is. And Keynesian economics, in the broadest sense, means that the government steps in big time. There's a whole range of government steps that fall under the heading of Keynesian. There's very mild, minimum Keynesian, then there's moderate Keynesian, then there's heavy-duty Keynesian, and so forth. So I don't mean to suggest it's all simple. It isn't. Typically, in a crisis, capitalist governments, when they get involved, start off with the mildest form of Keynesianism. If that's enough and they get through it, end of story. If it isn't, then they move kind of over, getting more and more intrusive into the economy as the situation requires. If there's pressure from below, particularly if unemployment rises, if bankruptcies spread, if there's a clamor from the people who are suffering that they want something done, the heavier that pressure, the quicker the transition from moderate to heavy Keynesianism will happen. What do I mean by Keynesianism moderate to heavy? Well, it starts off as follows. The reason it's called Keynesian is because of John Maynard Keynes, who writes this famous book, General Theory of Money, Income, and Employment. Interest is in it. Everyone calls it the General Theory, and you can look it up under that. John Maynard Keynes, 1936, in the depths of the Great Depression, he's British, writes this book and really basically says, and it's a bombshell when he writes it, he basically says, the conventional ideas of economics are wrong. The preface, the opening section of that book, read that. It's really stark how he says to the economists of his time, this idea, he says, that we've had, and he includes himself, because he was that which he is now criticizing, he writes, this idea we had that a private enterprise economy, a la Adam Smith, as if led by an invisible hand, will produce economic growth, general prosperity, and a kind of balanced economic thing. That was wrong, he says. It's a real mea culpa. We were wrong. And he says, I can show, and he does that, how and why a private enterprise economy using markets as the mechanism for distributing resources and goods, can and will regularly get itself into trouble. And by trouble he means it can and regularly will produce bouts of very severe unemployment. Unemployed people without work, unemployed tools and equipment and productive resources sitting idle. And he writes, it will produce these so often and or so severely that it will become politically impossible for capitalism to survive unless something is done. Notice the argument, because it will help you avoid mistakes now. No one argues that there can't be an economy that comes back after things get bad enough. In other words, the general consensus is that capitalism looks like this. That is, the ups and downs vary, but the ups are followed by downs and vice versa. So Keynes did not say, as some people have asserted, that capitalism is a system that if the government doesn't step in, it will never come back. It's not the argument. It will come back. But between now and when it comes back, there'll be such a level of unemployment, such a level of bankruptcy, so much lost output that people will have to live with, that it becomes politically untenable. Masses of people will not wait for as long as it may take. And remember, you never know how long it's going to take at the beginning. It doesn't have a form that you can say, well, by the way, you'll hear this all the time. You'll hear it over the dinner table at your house. Yeah, sure, it's going down, but it'll come back. It'll come back. And this certainty that it will come back, that's reasonable. But that you know when it will come back, that's not reasonable. That's silly. No one knows that. I don't know it. Nobody knows that. So it's always an open question. You can look at some signs to get a sense of how long it may take. But it's not an intellectual question of guessing. It becomes a very hot political question because on the down, however long it goes, the question is how many people are going to suffer, how much, and how much toleration for that suffering do they have? You can have a lot of suffering if people resign themselves to it. If they hunker down, if they turn inward, if they shift from hamburger to hamburger helper, if they all move into grandmother's house and stop renting other property, if people will do that, then you can go down for quite a while and the system isn't politically threatened. In which case, you don't have to do a government intervention. Not so much, not so soon. But on the other hand, even if there's only a little downturn, if you immediately have 2 million people in the street, France, a few weeks ago, you got a new situation, you got to do something. You got to do something right away. Because otherwise you're not going to be Prime Minister Sarkozy real long, or President Sarkozy real long. The level of opposition will wipe you out, and so the politicians understand economics in a way that the economists tend not to. Because it's a political problem that is crucial here, which is often the case in economics, which is why teaching economics over here and political science over there is such a bizarre quality of our education and messes you up. We also have in Europe, as I assume you all know, a whole collection of extreme left and extreme right political parties who pounce on these downturns because they have traditionally been opportunities for them to get lots more adherents to their perspectives. They're the ones who denounce the establishment from the left or from the right, and they typically frighten the people in power because they're serious parties. In France, for example, there's a serious leftist party, and there are serious rightist parties. And they move quickly into these situations and rally people who are disaffected from the establishment that they used to vote for because they blame them more or less rightly for what's going on. And so that becomes very dangerous for the center parties that you're used to. But the United States, of course, that's your point in a way, doesn't have this problem because we don't have, if we have them, they're so tiny that they don't make any difference. And consequently, the two parties, as you can see, keep right on going because they both assume that their supporters have nowhere else to go. So the general assumption of the Democrats is where they're going to go, vote Republican? Not likely. And vice versa for the Republicans. Not likely. And so there's a kind of paralysis, if you like, or momentum that isn't so quick to adjust here as it does come. That's all those things are right. Anyway, so what does it mean, Keynesian economics? What did he say? He basically said two things. And this is crucial for you to understand. Capitalist downturns, he argued, are fundamentally caused, to use the economics language, by a problem on the demand side of the economy. Think of the economy as supply and demand. There are all the suppliers of goods and services, producers, workers who supply their ability to work, and then there's a demand for all the products that the workers and the businesses together produce. So you have demand and supply. Keynes's understanding of economic crises that capitalism goes into has to do with collapses of demand. People either don't have the money to buy what they used to buy, or are not willing to pay for things even if they have the money. But the demand collapses. The buying power, it's a simple idea. So he shows how and why that would happen. I'm not going to do that now. We basically spent the whole semester talking about how and why it happened now, so I'm not going to do that. But given that that's his understanding, then the government must step in to provide the demand that the system left to itself fails to provide. The private enterprise market system fails, hits a rock, falls apart, and the central idea he has is there's not enough buying going on. Not enough buying by individuals, and not enough buying by businesses as they buy raw materials, equipment, tools, and whatnot. So the government is going to step in. Here comes the punchline. The government is going to create the demand that the private sector is incapable of creating in a crisis. And how is the government going to do that? Two ways, basically. One of them is by manipulating the monetary system of the economy. Manipulate money. The government does this, Keynes explains, because it is, after all, the monopolist of money. Right? The government is the only thing that prints and circulates money. If you print it and circulate it on your own, they're going to throw you into jail. Right? You're not allowed to. No business is allowed to. No individual is allowed to. Nobody's allowed to. It's a government monopoly, so they have a nice lever over this. And so what the government does, Keynes said, is it should manipulate the monetary system to boost demand. That's the plan. Make people buy when they otherwise wouldn't or couldn't. And how do you do that in the monetary realm? Two things. You pump money into the economy. You literally print it if you have to and inject it into the economy. Or you borrow it and inject it. A lot of ways of getting it, but the point is not how much you get, it's the pumping it in. And the second way you manipulate the monetary system is you lower interest rates. You make it cheaper for people who don't have the wherewithal to buy to borrow and buy. And you do that by lowering interest rates. Not a complex idea. The hope is that you lower interest rates, that homeowners will take out a mortgage because it'll be cheaper. You'll buy a car more quickly because the interest rate being lower, your monthly payments are reduced. Businesses that were thinking of expanding but didn't have the money can now go borrow at a lower rate, and people are likely to do so. So in other words, the first plan is for the monetary authority to increase the supply of money, increase the amount of money in circulation, and lower interest rates. So the government is now going to get in there and do that. Who is responsible? The central bank, the authority in each country that controls the money supply. In this country, in the United States, it's called the Federal Reserve. That's why you read so much about the Federal Reserve, because it's a key, typically a key player in the Keynesian program for how to deal with a crisis. Get in there, lower interest rates, and pump the economy full of money. And that's what the Federal Reserve has been doing, both under Bush and under Obama. And I'm going to show you how a little bit later. That's the big plan, and that's classical. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what they did do in every economic downturn we've had over the last 15 decades. That's what the Federal Reserve did, and it's doing it again. At this point, the only difference is some unique ways of doing it and the amounts of money stupefying. So bigger than in the past, and with some interesting wrinkles, which I'll tell you about. But the basic program, the basic game plan is tradition. So that was one thing Keynes said. Second thing is direct government stimulation of demand. That is, not by manipulating money, but by the government directly boosting demand. And that's called fiscal policy. F-I-S-C-A-L, fiscal policy. So the two tools of Keynesian economics, monetary policy, manipulate money, fiscal policy. I'm going to tell you now what fiscal policy is. Fiscal policy is not something that the Federal Reserve has anything to do with. They just deal with money. So fiscal policy is done by the president, or in our, that is the top political authority. And in our country, the president delegates that to the Secretary of the Treasury. So it's the job of the United States Treasury to carry out fiscal policy, and it's the job of the Federal Reserve to manipulate the money system. That's why the two people you will see in the news more than any others are Mr. Gaitner, before it was Mr. Paulson, right, coming from the, Gaitner and Paulson from the Treasury, fiscal policy, and Bernanke from the Federal Reserve, monetary policy. Those are the two heads of the two agencies whose job it is to undertake Keynesian policy. Yes?
Well, where would you put in those two things, the stimulus package?
That's fiscal policy.
But this was done in Congress, no?
Yeah, Congress has to pass, usually, when you authorize money, then the Congress has to pass it. But the people who do it are the Treasury. So the way it works is Congress authorizes the Treasury to have the money to go do it. But all the doing is the job of the Treasury. All due respect, I don't know if any of you have ever sat in on the session of the United States Congress. It's something all Americans should do. It'll get you really depressed. Because the level of conversation that you will see is very different from what you have been led to believe by your mother, your grandmother, your teacher, your minister, and anybody else who ever talked to you, who tried, with no bad intention, to make you have an appreciation and a respect. But when you get there, you will realize, as one of those wonderful moments in I forget who's, it was one of Michael Moore's films, where he's interviewing a senator. And what did the senator say? He says, you know, this is the
Fahrenheit 9/11.
Yeah, you don't have to be a genius to be in the Senate or something.
No, it was religious. Wasn't that?
Maybe that was maybe Bill Maher's on religion. But it's a wonderful moment. He's interviewing a sitting senator, and he kind of catches, it is Bill Maher, he catches the senator in a mistake or a contradiction. And he kind of, the way Bill Maher does, sort of gently, but he says, you just said a silly thing. And the senator was ready for it. He smiled and he said, well, you don't need to be very smart to be a United States senator. And he says that as if he has given a deft repartee. And you're sitting there going, ooh. Anyway, if you sit in the United States Congress, you'll realize that an awful lot of people are there who have no knowledge of and no interest in what they're there for. They're busy making money or building their career or whatever else is on their mind. But the details of legislation is really low on the list of things they're going to spend a lot of time learning. So I used to testify in the state legislature in Connecticut, which is the same people a little earlier in their career. It was unbelievable. I would have to explain things that was embarrassing. I found it difficult to explain because I thought I was embarrassing these people by explaining it until I realized it was fine. They had never heard of this before, and they were genuinely grateful that I could explain, 2 and 3 often work out to 5, and things like that. Anyway, the answer to your question is yes, there's lots of coordination between the Congress and the Treasury, because the Treasury wants the bill written in such a way that they can do the policy that they've decided on. They're the ones who do all the creative work. The Congress usually goes along. They nitpick a little here, but they basically go along. And the reason is the congressional, there's lots of Congress people. They have lots of problems on their agenda. The Treasury has got, 5,000 lawyers, economists, and accountants. They're in a position to work this stuff out in the way that the Congress rarely is. Usually what happens is the Congress goes along, and then later the Congress uses its research arm, the Congressional Budget Office, things like that, to do some research about what they were told and whether it really worked out, and then little red flags go up when they realize they've been a little bit hoodwinked here, because they vote on things. The budget is a document that's 3 or 4 inches thick. Unless you're a congressman or woman that has a lot of training and a lot of time or a lot of staff, and none of them have that, you can't. But you're asked to vote, and the political leaders are saying, we need your vote. Obama calls you up and says, I need your vote. What are you going to do? Threaten your career? Have bad relationships with the sitting president because you haven't got the... And you don't even know what's going on anyway. You're not going to read that 3 inches, and none of your staff can do it either. The end result is sort of steamroll. The president has enormous power because of the staff, because of the way things are set up. All of the focus of what the federal government does, all the focus of fiscal policy, basically comes from the Treasury and the handful of advisors at the top of the pyramid. People like Larry Summers and others who are specialist advisors to the president and work very closely with Gaither at the Treasury. They're the ones who work this out. Congress basically goes along. And if you see there in the debates, it's not about any of the real nitty-gritty details. It's kind of political grandstanding. You know, somebody says, no, this is going to borrow all this money. It's going to have our grandchildren having to pay this back. Isn't that terrible? No. Okay, but you don't need to read 3 inches of detail to figure out how to say that. You can say that before you read anything, which is the case. So you position yourself. You're a great supporter of our president helping to solve the problem, or you're a great critic or opponent who's worried about the suffering of the people from the... That's it. And this script was written before there was a budget. These people say this in their sleep. They say it in front of the camera. And you say, it's not really about what's going on. For that, you really have to read the details of what the Treasury does. And if you doubt me, please go and sit in on some of these hearings in Washington. That'll cure you real quick of any illusions you might have had how this stuff works. Okay, so fiscal and monetary policy is what Keynesian economics is about. Fiscal policy. Very simple. One way that fiscal policy works is that the government simply comes in and spends money. You want to beef up demand? You want to get more things being purchased? And remember, the idea is if the government comes in and buys a lot of stuff, then people are going to be put back to work making the stuff because the government is buying the stuff. So if you want to get the country going again, you want to get people back to work, you want to get the engines of production humming, and there's not enough demand from the private capitalist economy, the government comes in. So this is G here. This G in this little equation stands for government spending. So if G goes up, there'll be more spending. The government, and by the way, for what? It really doesn't matter in a funny way. Because what you want to do is get things purchased. So whether the government builds a road, builds a school, sends a rocket ship to Mars, has a couple of nice wars, whatever it is, the government's going to be buying tons of stuff to make a road, a bridge, a daycare center, a bomb. These are all ways. Now, economists get interested because some of them create more jobs than others. Some kinds of things the government buys are basically made automatically. They're high-tech things. They don't have to create many jobs. Whereas other things, for example, building a road is very labor-intensive. They need a lot of people. At least it used to be. It isn't anymore, but it used to be. Whereas other things like making high-tech weaponry, there's 3 people and 8 million computers and machines, and you don't create many jobs that way. But at least some, and then of course if you buy a bomb, and the company that makes the bomb has to buy metal and plastic and computers to make the bomb. You can see the way this works. So the government buys. The second thing that can happen is that T, which stands for taxes, can go down. That's another kind of fiscal policy. Increase government spending, and why would you cut taxes? Again, to beef up demand. The idea is simple. If we cut the taxes on people, that means more money out of your income is left in your hands, and the presumption is you'll spend it. Likewise, if we cut taxes on business, That leaves more of their profits in their hands, and the presumption is they'll have more to spend to grow their business and so forth. So fiscal policy can be raising government spending or cutting taxes or some combination of both of them. That's what governments do to beef up demand. But of course, right, if you're going to increase government spending, and if at the same time you're going to lower taxes, well then, the difference between the rising government spending, the government spending money, but T is falling, it's taking less in, is going to produce deficits. The government runs a deficit because it is spending more money than it is raising in taxes. Contrary to what you can hear our esteemed leaders of both parties say, when the government runs a deficit, this is not about it being stupid or incompetent or unable to manage its own household finance. It's the point to run deficits. That's the idea. It's not a mistake. It's not a bad byproduct. It's the point. So to attack the government for running a deficit is, I'm trying to think of a polite word, dumb. I'll use that one. It's so dumb. Is it possible for the government to screw up? Yeah, of course. And to do things it shouldn't and to waste money. Possible for the government? Of course it is. But the kinds of deficits we mostly see, for example, the one now, is a deliberate action that has been developed by Keynes in the 30s and followed by most governments ever since, when there's a downturn, for all the reasons I just went through. It is not some error or some failure. It is the point. So fiscal policies designed to boost demand as a way to respond to a crisis is typically what happens in capitalist economies. And obviously, if what you're spending is going up, because that's what you should do, and what you're taxing is going down, because that's what you're supposed to do, then how is the government going to get the money to spend more while it cuts taxes? It has to borrow it. It borrows the money. That's called financing the deficit. That's all the words we need. You finance the deficit by borrowing, because that's what enables the government to spend more while it taxes less. Since spending more and taxing less is fiscal policy, it runs a deficit which has to be financed by borrowing. Who do you borrow from? Anybody who will lend to you. It can be domestic, your own people. It can be people or governments or enterprises in other countries. And the United States borrows both, at home and abroad. In recent years, it's been borrowing a lot abroad because Americans either don't have or don't want to lend to the United States government. Notice it's all voluntary, right? And the government borrows. It offers to pay interest if you lend to it. And either that succeeds or it doesn't. Something we're going to come back to because it's actually very important moving forward. Okay? So that's fiscal policy. Let's now go back to do monetary policy. Why? Well, the mildest form of Keynesian economics is to do just monetary policy. That's where they always start. Their hope is, just by tweaking the monetary system, they'll solve the problem. It's usually when that doesn't work that you go on to fiscal policy. And indeed, George Bush did very little fiscal policy. If you recall, last summer there was a tax cut, but it was minimal. Everybody got $300 or $500, whatever. That's not a lot of money. And most of the money that the Bush administration was throwing at the problem was monetary policy. And to understand the logic of monetary policy, we're going to use this little equation. N times V equals P times T. Let me tell you what that means. Confusing because the T here doesn't mean taxes. N is the quantity of money in the economy. Bills, coins, checking accounts, quantity of money. V is a little peculiar, and I'm not going to take a lot of time to explain it. It's called the velocity of money. Think of it as the average speed with which a dollar moves from one person or a business to another. If people, for example, have a lot of money, but they keep it under the mattress, or they keep it in a bank account, it doesn't have much velocity. It's sitting there, literally. Whereas it's a very different situation if people spend the money right away, and the people they spend on in turn spend it quickly, then money is having a high velocity. And obviously, the impact of money on an economy depends on how fast it changes hands. My dollar bill will have a lot of impact if I spend it on you, and you spend it on her, and she spends it on you. That $1 is creating income and expenditures many times larger than one, because it's doing double duty, if you like, or repeated duty. Very different than if I get $1 and I keep it in my little safe box. And it's not good for me, but nobody else gets the benefit of that circulation. So V measures the average turnover, you might call it, of the money in our economy. So the combination of the quantity of money we have and the speed with which it changes hands tells you how much purchasing there is in our economy. How much money, how fast it's going, it gives you the total buying power, in a sense. Right? What these people buy, that's on the left-hand side of the equal sign, is on the right-hand side the total amount of stuff bought. T, total number of transactions, purchases, multiplied by the price of each one, because that's what the money has to pay for. You use your money not only to make a transaction, but you have to pay the price of that transaction, whatever that is. By the way, for those of you that are interested, this is called the quantity theory of money. Very old, very simple idea, been around a long time, but it's extremely useful for understanding what's going on. Is there a question? Yes.
How do you measure velocity?
You literally count the speed. In a way, the way the government does it, the statisticians do it, is they know how much money is out there, because the Federal Reserve literally, they keep track of how many $5 bills are printed and how many nickels are stamped out. So they know the quantity of money, and they know the total amount of transactions done, and they say for that amount of money, let's say, just pick a number, let's say we have $750 billion worth of money. But our GNP, the total amount of business done in the United States, is 6 trillion or 8 trillion. And then they figure, well, it must have gone around an average of 8 times or 12 times for that amount of money to have generated that amount of transactions. So they figure it out.
They just like solve for V, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
See, if you take a course in graduate economics, you learn how to solve for V. The teacher pats you on the head and you feel highly technically competent. That's what they do. I teach people how to do that and they feel really good about it. They immediately go to their friends, neighbors, boyfriends, husbands, and wives and show a little arithmetic and they feel a little better. In economics, there's a fetishization of mathematics. Mathematics is serious business. Poetry. I don't believe any of that, but I just want to understand the culture in which you live. Okay, so why is this interesting? Well, you can now see what the Federal Reserve is going to do. The Federal Reserve increases the quantity of money. Why? If you understand this, you'll understand a lot of modern economics. Their hope is that if the quantity of money goes up, people have more money, they will go and buy more things. There will be more, they hope, transactions, more things purchased. Why? Because if the transactions go up in response to there being more money to buy for them, then the transactions mean stuff is being sold, and that will translate into jobs for people to make the stuff that's being sold. So the logic of the Federal Reserve is raise the quantity of money in the hopes that it increases the amount of transactions. Here comes the fun stuff. Could something go wrong here? Well, the equation kind of shows you it could. Here's a possibility. If there's an increase of money, but the people who get the increase of money hoard it, put it in a safe deposit box, put it in the mattress, keep it in an account, then the V goes down, that's how that's expressed. And the rise in M is neutralized by the fall in V, and there's no rise in transactions.
Is that also if they use it for debt, or is that considered to go back into the cycle?
No, that'd be good. If you solve it with debt, then it's not circulating in any way that has anything to do with transactions in the sense of buying goods and services. That's right. Then it just circulates around inside the bank. It literally goes from your account to the bank's account, to whoever the lender. But the money literally doesn't move. It's just an accounting system. So you can see here a risk in any monetary policy that boosts the quantity of money. It can be neutralized. The government can fail to achieve its objectives if the institutions that get the money act in such a way to lower the V, then there's not going to be. Why is this interesting? Because that's what's been happening for the last 12 months. The government keeps pumping money into the system, nothing's happening. We don't have an increase in transactions, we have a decrease. You know why? Because the increase in money is more than offset by a cut in velocity, which means this is actually going down. There's an awful possibility. If you know algebra, if this goes up, but this goes down more than this goes up, then this has to go down too, or it can go down. By the way, there's another option. Here's another thing that can happen. If money goes up, but the velocity goes down because all the money is hoarded, it might not be that transactions go down. It could also be that prices go down. That's another way for the algebra to work out. In other words, as there's less money actually looking for goods and services, we have the same amount of transactions, but the prices go down. A deflation, that's called. A deflation. Well, it wasn't deflation. And there are lots of people who are worried that we're about to go into a spiraling down of prices. And why? Because the fear is if prices start to go down, all kinds of businesses will go out of business because they've made expensive investments in tools, equipment, and raw materials, paying high prices, and now when it comes to sell, a year later, having used all that expensive stuff, you got to sell at a lower price. The profit is wiped out. You can't stay in business. So a deflation is usually very nerve-wracking for businesses. Yeah.
Well, causality also could be in a way that as demand is less because V goes down, P goes down to try to induce demand.
Sure, that's another thing. I mean, it's not so much induced demand, but think of a business that has a big inventory. As prices start to go down, it freaks out because the prospect of further falls in prices, the value of the inventory that they paid for at a high price is literally disappearing on them, and the incentive then is sell it quick. Cut your price a little now so you don't have to wait 6 months and then you have to cut it big time. You see that all over New York now with apartments. Right? People are realizing, uh-oh, if I own a co-op or a condo or something, everybody is saying correctly that the prices of these things are now going down in New York and going down fast. So people who are thinking of selling, sell sooner, because the sooner you sell, the less the decline will have hurt you. So people who are buying houses at the same time are holding back. They understand, why do I buy now? If I can live with grandmother another 3 months, the same apartment's going to cost me $50,000 less. So the buyers stop and the sellers rush. That's a precedent. That's a class.
So it can be a race between let's throw more money out there to try to stop prices from going down.
Exactly. That's right. You might have the money, not even expecting more transactions, just you don't want that to happen for fear of what that will do. So if prices are starting to go down because things are tough, you throw money in, not so much to get it to go up, but just to keep it flat. There are people who believe that the Federal Reserve right now is pumping money into the economy for just that reason. But then they've given up on getting that done. They're willing to live with the rising unemployment in America. Why? Earlier discussion. There's no opposition yet. There's no rumbling, at least not much of it, from below. So they figure they can live with rising unemployment, but they're terrified of a deflation. So they're pumping money in to prevent that from starting in a big way.
And by printing it more than borrowing, and that for that purpose, right?
In this case, well, good question. The problem is to explain it requires me to explain how the Federal Reserve works. So that's going to take a little time. The Federal Reserve is constantly doing the following. It prints money and injects it into the economy. The way it does that is it buys bonds from individuals and companies and governments. For those of you who remember, that's some economics called an open market operation. You may have learned about that. Okay. But when the Federal Reserve wants to pump money in, they buy bonds from the public. So, for example, you could do that theoretically. At least you have a bond, something the government owes you. You lent to the government 5 years ago. You sit on a nice treasury bond. The Federal Reserve comes to you and says, "I want to buy that from you." So then, if you're willing, you give up your treasury and you get cash from the Federal Reserve. The cash you put in your bank account. That's more money in the system. You've exchanged, as an individual, something which is not money, a treasury certificate, for something that is money, and that increases the quantity of money. So when the Federal Reserve does that, it's boosting the quantity of money. Likewise, when the Federal Reserve thinks there's too much money in the system, it turns around and sells those bonds that it bought earlier back to the public, thereby taking the money that the public pays for that treasury security that they have, the bond, and neutralizing it, taking it out of circulation. So sometimes when it comes time to pump money in, it's the money they got earlier when they sold the bond. They don't necessarily have to print new money unless they run out of their stock of money, and they have quite a bit. But if they do run out, then they're not allowed to borrow. The Federal Reserve can't borrow, so they would have to go and print it, which they have the right to do, just so you all understand. I keep forgetting, people in America don't learn this because it scares them. The Federal Reserve determines, those 12 people on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, they decide when to print money. They sit around in a room, 12 people, and they make the decision. For example, let's print 50 billion new $10 bills. Can they make that decision? Yes. Do they have to get anyone else's permission in making that decision? No. Does the President have veto power over the decision? No. Does the Congress have anything to do with this decision? No. They're it. They're the final authority. And if they decide to have more money, they call the mint. Mr. Bernanke gets on the phone, calls the mint, says, "Hello, is this Harry?" "Yes." "Roll 'em," he says. That means the printing presses, and they produce $10 billion worth of new $10 bills, or whatever the number was. You understand? There's no gold that has to be there to back it up. There's nothing.
How does that impact the currency, though?
Always an open question.
Yeah.
If lots of people around the world want these dollars, fine. They print them, they inject them into the economy, and the rest of the world absorbs them. Maybe holding them as savings accounts, maybe holding them as reserves in other countries behind their currency. Because if you are the United States, then your currency is kind of like gold because it's so secure. It's got this country with the biggest armaments in the world, it's the richest country in the world, etc. Other countries, don't have that. Nobody has deep confidence in the Thai baht, for example. Right? I don't mean to single them out, but nobody does. And so if you want anyone in the world to use your baht currency, you have to promise that you have something, in case they don't want it anymore, that they can trade in that baht and get something they have belief in. Otherwise, they won't touch your currency. It'll be like a hot potato. So other countries have to have reserves in a way the United States does not. One of the wonderful benefits of being the country whose currency is the world money, the world reserve. So we don't have to do that, and therefore the Federal Reserve simply makes a decision, prints it, or pulls it out of the economy, or pumps it in. But you're quite right. If you are jacking up the quantity of money to beat the band, which we've been doing more than ever before in our history, if you're really pumping up the money supply, then there is the risk, which I think is where your question is going, that at some point, all of the people who have that money, who get it into their hands, Americans or foreigners, individuals, businesses, governments, there could come a time when they look at that money and they say, "Oh, I don't want to be sitting on all this paper," because they might be afraid that this paper is going to lose its value. Because that paper, you can't eat it. It's not good for, painting your house. So it's really just as good as what it can buy. Right? That's what the money is, just like the money in your wallet. You don't enjoy it. I mean, if you're crazy, you do, but you understand that the interest of your money is because it'll allow you to get a cup of coffee or to buy a shirt or the other things you need. And everybody who has money is, or should be, worried. Because if you were to believe that the prices of things you're going to buy with that money, today, tomorrow, next year, are going up, then the very prospect of rising prices means the value of your money is dissolving before your eyes. In an inflation, even if there isn't an inflation, but you think there might be an inflation, holding money is a bad idea. You're losing. So if you pump up a lot of money, you run the risk that some of the people who have this money are going to get nervous. And then they could start a stampede. And that stampede nobody could stop. All it takes is for 12 Nigerians, 14 Panamanians, 127 French people to say, oh, I don't want to hold the dollars I have. I'm getting rid of my dollars. I want to buy something that is going to rise with all the other prices. They begin to think or see rising prices. So they're going to go buy something because holding money in a time of rising prices is nuts. They're going to convert their money into something called a solid asset. Something they hope will go up with the level of prices, which money never does. So they'll buy things like gold or oil or some scarce materials, maybe even land, figuring it'll go up. But dollars become the thing you want to get rid of. At that point, once it starts, everybody who has dollars is looking at rising prices and quickly dumps their dollars, which makes the inflation go worse, which freaks more people out, and it becomes a fire, a kind of a conflagration. And we've had many examples in history, including modern history, where this happened.
The Asian crisis, right?
The Asian crisis that has happened. The most spectacular example that I usually give is Germany in the 1920s. I think I mentioned this once before. Between 1920, middle of 22 and 1923, Germany went from, I don't know what it was, 6 Deutschmark to the dollar to 4 trillion Deutschmark to the dollar. Can you imagine? In Germany, you can see bills that were produced by the German government at that time, which would look like a bill for 1,000 Deutschmark, stamped. This is now 10,000. Then stamped again. This is now 40. They didn't have time to print the things, so they just, that's a crazy inflation. But it had unbelievable social consequences. Don't forget I mentioned you before, but I've done it again. In that situation, what happens to a German middle class, every one of whose families had saved money year by year for decades, over several generations, and had saved money in cash. In a matter of months, that cash, the whole reserve of the family, the traditional German bourgeois family, or working class family, that counted on having something to fall back on if someone got sick, if there was an injury, that was worth nothing. The money had become effectively worthless. And they went crazy as a people. And they elected Adolf Hitler a few years later. And not that that always has to happen, but I'm sure every German I've ever spoken to makes a direct connection that one, not the only, but one of the key causes of Germany kind of going nuts there in the Hitler time was because they were all freaked out. They had lost World War I. The Kaiser, it's a word for Tsar, the Kaiser of Germany had abdicated in 1918 and was immediately replaced by a socialist government. And that was a little too much for the German middle class. And then, icing on the cake, 3 or 4 years later, their savings are gone. They went nuts. They went crazy as a people and looked around for who to blame and decided it was communists and Jews and the rest of the rest of the story. But it's very dangerous. But yes, that can happen. But don't think of it, don't be automatic in your thinking. In other words, there's no, you'll hear it often said, well, we're increasing the quantity of money and therefore we're going to have an inflation. Stop. An inflation is if there's prices are rising. Usually it means more money is chasing goods. But if more money is produced and more goods are produced, there's no inflation. The extra money simply goes to buy more goods at the going price. It is always the hope of a government that increases the money supply that it will stimulate more jobs and more production. If that happens, happy news. The extra money has the desired effect. More transactions, no increase in prices. That's the hope. Can they guarantee that? No. What happens? This is a little aside issue, but you're learning a lot of economics here, more than you probably want to know. But what happens if a government like ours pumps a lot of money in? And let's suppose the unwanted thing happens. You're concerned. This extra money starts being used to buy stuff. Remember, in America now, we're increasing the quantity of money while we're laying people off. We're actually producing more money and less goods. So there is a reason to be worried that, the potential, not the actual, but the potential for inflation is certainly being stoked up. And now let's suppose it happens. The inflation begins to go. Well, is the government powerless? No. We even have an example. In 1971, it's not that long ago, a conservative president of the United States at the time, Richard M. Nixon, conservative Republican president, I mean, not as conservative as George Bush, he's a conservative president. Here's what he did. He was faced with this situation. Money going up, prices beginning to go up. He didn't want that. He wanted to be able to pump the money in and not have it be going in the direction of higher prices. He wanted to make that not happen. He wanted a transaction. He wanted the money to generate and to stimulate more goods production. What did he do? Very interesting thing. He did something which capitalist governments often do. He declared a wage price freeze. August 15th, 1971. I actually watched his speech on television that night, which, looking at many of you, is something you couldn't possibly do. Anyway, what did he say? Very interesting. This conservative Republican president, standing in front of the cameras, looks into the cameras. He was not photogenic. In fact, looking at Richard Nixon, you appreciate whatever else you can say about Bush and Obama. They sure look better than he did. Anyway, he stands there, looks into the camera with that sort of sour, used car salesman face that he had, and he says, really interesting, he says, as of tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, any business in the United States that raises its price, I will arrest you and you will go to jail. Any union or worker that demands and gets an increase in his or her wages, I will arrest you and you will go to jail. We are freezing wages and prices. That's fantastic because it means now the government can pump more money in. So there's not going to be any inflation because they arrest you if you raise the price. Nobody's going to raise the price. Business is over. So the prices are effectively frozen. Well, if M goes up, assuming nothing happens much here, if this is frozen, that will go up. Right? Because if you think of it very simply, if I give all of you $1,000 in cash, right? And I say, okay, I'm going to give you this money, but on one condition. I want you to go out, run around the blocks around here, try to avoid the cops, and go buy something. Go buy something. Right? Suppose I did that. Then all the shopkeepers, they hear about this quick enough, and go, wow, all those new school students have more money in their pocket. They're going to come into my store. They're going to buy clothing, they're going to buy food, they're going to buy whatever. I have two choices, as all businessmen do. I can either say to them, oh, go to prices, right? I can do that to you. Or they can say, I'm not going to raise my prices, but I'm going to order from my supplier a lot more stuff because all the extra money these students have, they're going to buy more stuff if the price is the same. That's all businesses always have that choice. More stuff at the same price or higher price for the same stuff, right? Or some mixture of that. But the government changes all that when the government says, no, you don't have that. Now every businessman is going to do what? Knowing that there's more people coming with more money. And he can't raise the price. He's going to order more stuff. That's the only way to take advantage of the fact you all have more money. That's the same thing. More money is pumped in the economy. Everybody can come to spend more. The businesses are not allowed to raise the prices. They'll order and sell more stuff with the money they can.
But for that to work today, wouldn't they also have to say that we can't spend it on our debt? Because the money could get pumped in, right? and they could freeze wages and prices, and we would spend all the money on our debt.
Yeah. And then this
it
would
would
collapse.
still be a problem, right?
That's
So they
right.
would have to
That
tell
would- they'd
wage
have to-
prices and
They'd have to work on that too. That's right.
How long did that last?
a lot of
Then it immediately becomes a fantastic struggle. Think of it politically. You can enjoy it. By the way, this happens all the time in many countries. It happens more often in many other countries than it does in our own. I picked the American example because I want to focus on the United States. And there have been calls to do that since 1971. They were not heeded. One of the reasons was the minute you set this thing in, as Nixon did, the fighting begins. And you can see why. I'll give you an example. A company purchased last week or last month a whole bunch of stuff to go into production based on their assumption that they'd be able to raise their prices 4%. You just killed it. You just wiped this business out. Through no fault of the businessman or woman didn't do anything wrong. They were doing their usual thing, but they just happened to do it in such a way that this law, so those folks would come and demand an exemption. So let's suppose the government gave them an exemption because this was really discriminatory against them. Yeah, but now comes everybody else who wants an exemption. And if they figure out how the first one got an exemption, they can, how should I say this politely, redate their invoices to make their situation look like that too. That's called creative accounting. And you hire an accountant who helps you with this, right? The businesses aren't stupid. Everybody. Now the unions come and say, wait a minute, you're giving exemption, that's making things cost more. It's not fair to limit our wages. Don't let them go up if we're actually fair. So we want exemptions too. For example, we agreed 6 months ago to forego a wage increase to help the company out, and they agreed in return to give us a 4% increase next week. They're telling us this can't happen. Well, we and the employer made a deal based on something. This is going to help the employer big time and screw us. We want an exemption. So there begins to be a mounting political storm as all the forces on the side of business and on the side of labor try to get out from under the limits of this kind of thing. Yeah.
What people should recognize is that inflation was pretty severe.
Very severe.
It was in 1971.
Yes.
I mean, I remember.
That's why it was done.
Yeah.
That's why it was
gallon
done.
of milk went from 40 cents to over $1 in a year.
That was when you were beginning to get the oil shocks and so forth. Things were beginning to really heat up. By the way, one of the key reasons, notice the year, 1971. We had been at war in Vietnam for about 6 years at that time. Johnson, Nixon were the presidents of the war, during the war period. They faced the typical problem of a political leader in wartime in a capitalist economy. How do you pay for a war? Vietnam is about as far away as you can get from the United States. It's an extremely expensive place to have a war. Right? You got to get all the equipment, all the troops halfway around the world. You got to feed them there and house them and all that. It's very, very expensive before you even get to the combat costs, which are enormous. So this was an extremely expensive war involving, I believe, about 500,000 American troops were there, about 500,000, something like that. So you're talking a huge expense. So the question was, how was this going to be paid for? Well, the government has two ways to do it. Either taxes people to raise the money to pay for the war, or it doesn't. But the opposition to the Vietnam War, which eventually brought it to an end, was mounting in the United States from the beginning, bigger and bigger. The American people were, let's put it nicely, split about this question. Right? But there would have been no split at all if the president had said, not only am I sending 500,000 American troops over there, and a lot of them were injured and killed and so forth, but I am also happy to announce to you, my fellow Americans, that I'm going to take another several $1,000s from you every year from now. That's it. War would take, I don't know, 3 days, be finished. The opposition would have gone crazy. They understood that. There's lots of evidence for that. I'm not making this up. So they made the decision, as is often done. I don't want to pick on Mr. Johnson or Mr. Nixon in this regard. This is typical. You can't fight a war if people actually have to pay for it. Now we can go. Bush and Obama used both of them. Bush a bit more monetary than fiscal. Obama building up the fiscal, but continuing the monetary. Other than that, there's not much difference. They both did the same thing. And this is like what was done in the 1930s by Roosevelt. He also did monetary and fiscal policy. It didn't work for Roosevelt. That is, the Depression kept on getting worse. It is quite possible that it would have been yet more worse if he hadn't done it. There's no way really to know that, but that's certainly possible. But it didn't work in the sense that the political pressure got greater. So eventually, Roosevelt had to do something Obama has not yet done. This is an example now of a solution to the crisis that is available, that has been used in the United States and in many other countries, but has not yet been used here, and probably because the political screaming from below hasn't made it happen. What did Roosevelt do? Roosevelt boosted demand by something beyond conventional monetary and fiscal policy. He directly hired people. That is, the government itself became a massive, it is a phrase that was used, employer of last resort. The basic idea here is if the private economy, private enterprises, cannot hire enough people to provide work in a society like ours, if, in other words, we have side by side millions of people who want a job, roughly as we do today, many millions of people looking for work, we have about 30% of our industrial capacity, that is machines, equipment, floor space in factories and offices, desks and computers, not being used. Roughly, we're working at about a 70% capacity. That means 30% of the means of production are sitting idle. So we have millions of people who want work. The means for them to work with are available. And Lord knows we have unmet social needs. We need to rebuild our cities. We need to build daycare centers. We can all make a laundry list of what we need. So we have needs that are not being met, people who want to work, and all the equipment and raw materials for them to work with, but we don't get them together. That is the most profound indictment of an economic system one can think of. Why do you have an economic system? It's to not have that. I mean, that's the job of an economic system, to put together the people who want to work and need to work with the social output that those people could produce if you have the capacity to produce it. We have it. We have the capacity, we have the people, we have the needs, and they sit there staring at each other, the needs, the capacity, and the people. Nothing is happening. That's a very serious problem. You can't long continue that way. Even with a population very unused to thinking this way. I wish I had a camera that I could take your pictures and show it back to you, because your faces, as you digest what I'm saying, they're giveaways. You haven't yet mastered that, older person's ability to see that. Some of you, I'm sure, have. Many of you have, to your credit. Anyway, but that's a disaster, and that can't last very long, even in a country with not developed political mechanisms of coping with that situation. So Roosevelt understood that. And as I think I mentioned to you before, and it's worth mentioning here again, in the 1930s we had a very strong, relative to today, trade union movement. And not only was it strong, but it was getting stronger. That is, the trajectory was like this. If you've never read this, read about it. It's called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. You've all heard of the AFL-CIO. Well, once upon a time, there was no CIO. There was only the AFL. And that was a union of unions of craft workers, skilled workers. The new thing that happened in the 1930s was the mass organization of people in an industry, whether they had a lot of skill, little skill, or no skill at all. So the 1930s is the organization of steel, rubber, chemical workers, all the big auto workers, and all of that was developed in the 1930s. So the trajectory of labor organization took off. From 1930 to 1955, American unionization was way up. The exact opposite of what has happened since then, which is way down. So the government was facing not just upset workers who were poor or unemployed, but it was facing ever more militantly organized workers who demanded things. You also had a quite strong socialist party, and you had a quite strong communist party in the United States. For those of you who are not aware of it, you may not know this, but we've had periods of time in the United States when we had strong socialist and communist parties in many parts of the United States. You know, there was here in Manhattan, for example, in those years, a famous city councilman named Benjamin Davis, an African American, who was also a communist. Kept being elected over and over again. So you had a voice in the city council that was screaming and yelling about these issues. It didn't get buried. He had the courage to kind of stand up. We had a congressman, an Italian-American congressman named Vito Marcantonio in Harlem, who was also, he wasn't a member of the Communist Party, but for all practical purposes, he was also. This is what Harlem was not yet what it is now. It's much more ethnically mixed, mixed in a different way than it is now. Anyway, these people were very loud and vociferous. They were communist officials, they were mayors, and state representatives all over the United States. The Socialist Party was strong in many American states, particularly in the Midwest. Some of you may find that bizarre, but that's a mistake. American politics can change real fast. The states that had the strongest socialist movement, the strongest in America, Oklahoma. I'm trying to figure that out. If you go to Oklahoma now, you won't see it, but it's part of its history. Other powerful states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana. You know, so things change in the United States. But in those days, these were powerful political parties. So what Roosevelt had to do was to say, okay, I am going to become, the government's going to become the employer of last resort. He hired millions of people. That's a way of boosting demand. You're taking people who have nothing, no income, no job, and suddenly they have a job, you're paying them. And they can now turn around and buy food, clothing, shelter, and all the rest of it.
Not only that, but they will because
They have nothing, that's right. They're wonderful because they're going to save nothing, they're not going to wait. It's the fastest turnaround imaginable because you have people who are at the bottom and are desperate. And you now give them a job, they're going to spend it right away, which in terms of velocity and turnover is what you want, in terms of maximizing the economic impact of doing it. Imagine today, I'll jump ahead a little bit, but I want to drive this point home. Imagine today. Suppose you took the several million people that have been laid off over the last 6 months. I believe it's now in 3 or 4 million range, something like that. Now, those are many of the people who can no longer cover their mortgage because they're unemployed. So the people who are being laid off are also a significant part of the foreclosed home problem. If those people were given a job in the United States government, hired them, not only would they be able to live a decent life, and not only would they stimulate the economy by turning around and spending the money, but one of the things those people could now do is maintain their mortgage payments, so that you would see an immediate reduction in the whole housing disaster that we're living through, because it would improve that situation as well. So you have to ask yourself the question, and I want you to ask it, why is that not happening? Why is that? And the answer is Obama, like Bush, and like all the others, is trying to do basically as little as possible and hope it works. And now the question will be, if it doesn't, how soon will he take what other steps that he now not only isn't discussing, but it's hard for me, since what I just told you is not something that happened in the Soviet Union or far away. It happened in our country 75 years ago. It's not that long. So it's kind of remarkable that you don't read about it every day. Why isn't there a continuous discussion of this policy tool that we've used before in a similar circumstance? That can't be an accident. It's not that nobody's forgotten this. It's in every history book. So what is this? This is a kind of national desire not to go there yet. But it's a desire, look, try to keep a perspective. A year ago, it's not that long, a year ago, if we'd been having this class and I said to you, Here in America, I predict that within a year's time, the government will come in and fire the head of General Motors, take over banks. You'd all thought I was nuts. You would have looked at me and, what is this? What a doomsday scenario. This guy believes this. I'm not taking any more courses on him. He's a crazy person. I mean, very few people foresaw the level of collapse, the speed of the collapse, and what conservative Bush did as the thing unraveled on him. Right? So if that was possible, then you have to now be aware that we might be at a remarkable place when this college resumes in the fall, when we've had another 5 months or so, whatever it is, before we reconvene here in September. Things that we are just beginning to think about, as I'm trying to lay them out for you, may become everyday news by that time. And I wouldn't be surprised at all. Yeah.
What was, during the 1930s when this was actually happening, what were some of the common oppositions to that type of policy?
Oh, there were many. There was a standard one, which you were already getting. I mean, some of you are noticing that the Republicans are increasingly referring to Obama as a socialist, or that what he's doing is. You had the 1930s. That sounds kind of strange now, given that we don't have socialism in this country. We have something to do, but they're very tiny. We know it. So it sounds a little off when you hear it now, which should. It's off. But in the 1930s, it was much less off because there were socialists all around. Socialist parties, socialist movement, socialist newspapers. That was part of everybody's life, certainly here in New York. There were loads of them. So he was attacked for that. This is socialism. And remember also, that's a more scary proposition because in the 1930s, there is this country, the Soviet Union, over in Europe. And here's the thing about the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, when the Great Depression hit, and the United States and France and Germany and England all had big unemployment, the Soviet Union didn't have any unemployment, which made it look like socialism wasn't so bad. Here's the Great Depression, they don't seem to have it over there. They have keeping everybody working. Everybody's working. And so it meant you had a socialist movement and a communist movement, and they pointed to something that looked like it was working, but that's scary. So people who were nervous about socialism had a lot more to be nervous with than people today, for whom socialism doesn't look like a big scary event or place or anything to worry about. So the people who are attacking Obama, like the ones in the Great Depression, have less to work with on that game than they had in the 1930s. That was one. The second one was a very more powerful one. It's the issue of competition. Private enterprises like to have, in front of the Kiwanis and on television and at the annual meeting of the Businessmen Association of our town, upstairs one or another local businessman gives a very boring speech that goes perfectly with the rubber chicken served at that. And says about how competition is what we want, and competition made our country great. But the minute the government goes into competition with these people, they do not want that at all. And so they attack the government for hiring because it puts the government, and that's unfair, in competition with private enterprise. The government is big and powerful and has all these resources, and we're private enterprise, we don't have all that, and this is going to undermine us. Hidden behind that is the fear that if people see how the government is doing and what the government is doing, they might prefer that. Ooh. And then where would we be if we're a private enterprise? So private enterprises have a long and deeply ingrained opposition to competition from the government. And businesses were very scared about that. Remember, the government doesn't have to make a profit. There are no shareholders. So whereas the price of a private enterprise has to pay for the materials and pay for the labor and produce a profit, if the government is running, it just has to pay for the materials, pay for the labor, end of story. That's an interesting idea. Might make everything cheaper. Ooh, let's not go there. If you're a private enterprise, you don't want this. So he had a lot of opposition. I do not mean to suggest that when Roosevelt did it, it was all clear sailing and no problem. Not at all. There was lots of opposition, ideological opposition, competitive. He had to struggle. And there were people who hated Franklin Roosevelt, worked against him ceaselessly. You know, he was a Democrat. The Republicans were the place where you had that. And they were
Despite also, he was very careful to try to do things, to pay people less than average wages, and to do things that private enterprise wasn't doing.
Exactly.
He was very careful.
One of the ways that governments, when they act this way, try to limit that opposition. That's exactly right. They try to be non-competitive. They try to pay lower wages. Why? Because they don't want the people to run away from the private job and come to the public job. So they pay lower wages, which of course makes the people with a government job pissed off. They're doing just as much work, working just as hard as in that private enterprise. Why am I not? This is trouble. This is tension. And the other one, which is even more impressive, is they try to go into producing things that there is no private company doing. You know, for example, providing low-cost daycare. Nobody does that. There's no money in it. So if the government does it, it's not going to undercut. But of course, if there's a high-cost daycare privately, they could feel aggrieved even by that. So then you try to find something that, you know, literally nobody's doing. And of course, one of the popular ones is for the government to go into the business of war. Because nobody is in the war business, except our enemies, right? So we are going to go into the war business, and the government then becomes a producer of a war, but that needs to buy all this stuff from private enterprise, so they're pleased with government orders, but none of them is in the business of making a war, so then none of them's going to lose a contract to go and whack Iraq, because we don't do it that way. It's a government monopoly of warfare. So they have all of those things. The other one was to build the national parks. One of the things they did in the 1930s, those national parks you might to visit out in the West, many of those were created by armies of this. Or the other one, the one I love most, WPA, this program, it's very interesting for you to read, in which the government hired artists, writers, painters, sculptors, photographers. Some of the great photographers, Lang and Richard Avedon, a lot of the great photographers of the 20th century got their start, if you're interested, by getting that job, often as just beginning in their artistic career.
And they would have never even done it.
Or they would never have done it, because this was not, you want to get a job in the 1930s and there was nobody hiring and the government was hiring an artist? Hello, I'm an artist, right? Because you got a job. So that's exactly right. People, and they tell the stories. You read some of the greatest painters and others who got their start by becoming interested. That was only a vague interest of theirs as a high school kid, because there was now work. But also you produced in America a level of cultural opportunity across America we've never had before, and we've never had since. Theater troops all over the United States, in little towns and villages, because the government paid them, and the government said, okay, we're not paying you to be a theater troupe. Go out and put on plays. And then the idea, because it was a kind of a democratic spirit at the time, the best and most important thing is put on plays where people have never had a live troupe. They don't have any idea, no one has ever done that in their community. Large parts of America have never had an opera in town, or a theater in town. You know, they maybe had a rodeo, or they maybe had, you know, traveling amusement park, but they've never had this kind of stuff. And many Americans got exposed to artistic and cultural activity in ways that they never had seen before. It was very popular, very exciting. Many of America's greatest art, Norman Rockwell, many whose names you know, that's how they got their start, that's how they got their fame, and that's how they became household names in the United States, because the government basically had created a subsidized cultural program.
So are you saying that I'd like to know all these things, except war, can be done today, despite the fact that, for example, debt of an average American is 140% of the standard income. Back then it was 20%.
That's right. Sure.
And the global economy is very complicated. There's EU, Latin America, like Russia, China, all that.
Still could be, absolutely could be done. Those are different things. You could even make a case that if we did it, it might reduce the level of debt on the Americans and so forth. It also might become a model for what is done in other countries. I haven't even gotten to the things that are being done in other countries that we're not doing. I just started by telling you about something we did in the United States. since my presumption is that'll be easier to get people to think about today if it's not a foreign event. Americans get nervous when you use examples from other countries. So I'm using one that comes from our own society. And I think it's highly likely between you and me that we're going to see this. That Mr. Obama will find a way, that's what his advisors are there for, to become a champion of helping people by giving them a job, doing something that everybody can see is good for us as a country. I mean, this can be, I think this can be marketed by it. You'll have opposition. Your question is a good one. There will be opposition. I'm sure that's why it hasn't been discussed to this point. But I think that can be managed to look and package it in such a way that American needs.
You're saying they could go into the war business, does that also include prison business?
Sure.
Is that,
We already are doing
right,
that.
I'm saying, like, is that gonna,
That's a solution to the unemployment problem, right? You take them off the street and you put them in a jail.
or build a jail?
Or build a jail. You need to build it or to
Everything.
fill
Just
it.
the-
Yeah. The trouble is, we're already at a very advanced stage, and it's not so clear we can do all that much more. On the other hand, if our unemployment lasts, and if, which sometimes happens, it takes the form of an increase in crime of one kind or another, then you could easily, you live in America just like I do, you could see the movement developing as people freak out about that for another burst of prison construction and imprisonment of people. But we are already the country that imprisons at a higher rate than anywhere else in the world, and there are limits to that too. And it's also economically a disaster. It costs, I don't remember what I said, 35 grand a year. What?
Per person?
Per person.
If you're 60 pounds.
Is it more, right? Okay, but even if we said it was, say, 40,000, it becomes crazy, right? A good half or more of the people in jail would gladly exchange that position for a job that paid them 35 grand a year, and it would be cheaper for everybody. The difference is, for $40,000, they sit and rot in a cell, whereas for $35,000, they would have a job which would make them happier and better people, help their families, and they would be producing something rather than sitting in a cell. It is crazy.
Unless you have a system that is not providing enough employment.
That's right. And in our society, you get craziness squared. That is, it's crazy to do this, and then you realize that our system is so screwed up, it's even crazier not to do it. So you end up sticking them in jails. And if you know something about what is called recidivism, that is the probability that a person incarcerated who is released after a period of doing their sentence to come back into the justice system, we have one of the highest recidivism rates in the world. That is, our prisons make prisoners worse. And you've all heard the stories, whether in the comic form and otherwise, of the kinds of experiences you can expect, sexual and otherwise, in America's prisons. It's not so surprising that people come out in worse psychological shape after prison. And if prison is a place you stick troubled people, and they come out more troubled, then that, like everything else, is a system that isn't working. So that if the solution is to have more prisons where more people are going to be more damaged, there's a level of lunacy here that can't go on forever. It's like that offer that's too good to be true. Sooner or later you discover it isn't true. That's why it's too good to be true. Okay, let's continue. All right. You now have an overview, which is what you need, to see how what Bush and Obama have been doing have been combinations of monetary and fiscal policy. However, as with each case of an economic collapse of capitalism, there are always particular things that differentiate one incident from another. The 1930s, while it has many similarities with today, also has differences. But don't think too mechanically, you have to hold them in mind. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the differences now, which is where these crazy things come in, that you read about and that I want to go through with you. We won't be able to do all that today. I left enough sessions at the end of the semester that I'll be able to take you through this. But you'll have the framework with monetary and fiscal to understand these things rather than have them look like a collection of initials that you can't keep straight in your mind, which is how most Americans are struggling with this. Okay. What happened in the United States, which we talked about, and I'm going to bring you back to what we did a few weeks ago, was that the crisis, the collapse of demand, had a lot to do with debt. With the fact, remember, we went through this, that in the 1970s, the long American history of rising real wages came to an end. We went through why that happened. And basically what was done in the United States was that the working class, which expected, which presumed that it would do better and better with each passing year, with each passing generation, worked itself to the point of trying to be able to enjoy the American promise, the American dream of rising consumption, even when the rising wages to pay for it were no longer there. And if you recall, there were two things that I stressed. One, more work by more people, something that came up again last week. Matty Fraud was here, that some of you mentioned. But the other thing is what I want to focus on, the borrowing of money. Americans went on a tear to continue to consume when their wages didn't go up anymore, their real wages didn't go up anymore, by borrowing at a cascading rate. And that is an unsustainable arrangement. You can't keep borrowing because while the fun is when you borrow and spend it, you now have to pay it back with interest. And as you keep borrowing, the payback portion rises. And so 2 years ago or so, it hit this historical, never before, 15%, roughly, 14, 15%. That is the percentage of disposable income, the amount of money you have after you pay your taxes and so on, that was going not to buy goods and services, but to service your debt, it's called. That's paying back principal and paying interest. $1 out of $7 by that time wasn't available to buy stuff. And the American people couldn't do it anymore. They couldn't cover the mortgage, they couldn't cover a whole bunch of things if 1 out of every $7 they earned was simply paying back debt. They had run into a classic problem that is encountered by everybody who borrows. Every country that borrows has this problem. Many countries have collapsed because they borrowed in such a way that the cost of servicing the debt meant they couldn't feed their people anymore, and then the thing blew up. There was a revolution or turmoil in society. Ours took a form in our country that was very peculiar and new. As the American people borrowed like crazy and spent like crazy, because remember, borrowing is not like rising wages. If your wages go up 4 or 5% and you have that money, you can go out and spend it. But it's limited by the increase in your wage. Borrowing, particularly in the 1990s and after 2000, is kind of a limitless thing. Many of you experienced that. You maxed out one credit card, great, I'll get another one. There were advertisements offering you credit cards coming in the mail or being handed out to you in the hallways of your school or wherever on a banks were looking to lend you money. Try to go back just 2 or 3 years and you'll see that they have forgotten, but we were all awash in people pushing loans on us. And Americans wanted to borrow, so there was lots of money to be lent. This was a marriage made in heaven, so we borrowed like crazy. The first thing we did as a people, was to borrow against our property. And that's understandable because a lender doesn't want to lend to us, the working people of America, unless they have some security, some collateral, something they can get in the event we punk out and can't pay back. And the only thing Americans have that anybody wants, basically, is their house, their home. It's the only property that most Americans have. And secondarily, if there's anything else that we have, it's our automobile. So the 2 big things are the apartment and the automobile. And both of those were used as collateral. That is, Americans who didn't do this before, but starting in the 1970s, Americans stopped paying for cars and began to buy them on time. That's when many of the modern gimmicks of car purchasing were developed. When you pay over 4 or 5 years, a monthly payment. And so that's a debt. You borrow if you're not familiar. What you're actually doing when you buy a car in the United States is a bank is lending you money. You never see it because the bank lends you the money but immediately gives it to the car dealer. So you actually don't see it, but technically it's a loan for which you are responsible. So you have to pay back to the lender over 4 or 5 years a monthly, which covers both the return of the principal that was lent to you and given to the car dealer to buy your car, plus the interest that's carried on that. And it always happens. Give me 2 more minutes. So what Americans did is they began to borrow a huge amount of money on cars and homes. Okay? And that wasn't so unusual, except the scale of it was. But what was really unusual was a new gimmick in the United States, which I talked to you about, but which you're now going to see shapes the crisis and the response of the government. The lenders discovered that they could make more money making these loans for your house, for your car, if they could turn around and resell the loan to somebody else. It turned out that all over the world, people who had money, governments, businesses, and individuals, would rather see their money in the United States than anywhere else in the world. We're the richest country, we're the most powerful. To make a long story short, it's the safest place to keep your money. So the rest of the world wanted to find a way to bring money into the United States. Now the big banks in the United States began to figure something out. We have a way for the people of the world, for the governments of the world, for the rich of the world to invest in the United States that we never had before. We're going to take the loans we've given to people for their homes and cars. We're going to bundle them into a new kind of security. It's called an asset-backed security. It's a security that doesn't give you a share of a company that's doing anything. It gives you a share of a group of mortgages. So when John's family and Mary's family and your family make their monthly payments for the local Gypsy Doodle Bank for the mortgage on their house, a portion of that is going to an investor in Lebanon who bought the security in which that mortgage you took out of the local bank, which the local bank sold to a New York bank, which a New York bank sold to a bundler, that's what they call, who made the bundles of them and issued and developed the security and sold them to another investor. So an investor in Lebanon, I'm just picking that as a place, an investor in Lebanon owns a security that actually means he's a part owner of the mortgage you make monthly payments on. Okay? These securities were then sold all over the world. Okay? So the debt, here comes the point, the debt that was built up by the Americans, way beyond the point of what they could afford, ended up becoming the great new security in portfolios of rich people and governments across the globe. So that when the American borrower defaulted, couldn't pay anymore, it became an instantaneous global financial crisis.